in the last session, we were talking about revival in the Cambodian refugee camps. And I want to continue to share about the fruit of that revival and how God moved through these camps. I was talking in the last session about how the United Nations leader tried to kick us out of the camp, but God ended up kicking him out of the camp. And then, the United Nations made a rule that everybody who works in the refugee camp has to be a professional. They have to work in the hospital or in some kind of role of not being a missionary, but only doing that which is somehow productive in the natural for these refugees. So my leader, Steve Good, he knew that all I was doing is praying and teaching the Bible and sharing and discipling these refugees. So he was told that they need a new leader for the construction in the refugee camp and another camp. So he said, pray about it. So I prayed about it, and I really had peace. You know, many times God speaks to me with that supernatural peace. And he also confirms it through the Bible, his word. So I knew, okay, this is God's will for me, is to go be the leader of this construction. And so I went there, and I had 100 workers under me. Can you imagine that? I've never studied about construction. Never had any background with construction. But it didn't really matter because they make the houses with bamboo and banana leaves or palm leaves. So, but what they needed is somebody to be responsible. See, the United Nations and people who work with these kind of refugee camps, the main thing that they need is people who are honest and not corrupt. Because people send money to the United Nations and Red Cross to go to these refugee camps and stuff like that. But many times it never actually gets to the refugee camp because of all the corruption. The money comes in there and they maybe buy food, but then the food ends up going to the army or something else and not to the people who are actually starving or needy. So that's the thing is they need responsible people. So I was in charge of 100 workers and what was built and what was not built in the refugee camp. So I became, like a very important person there, VIP, even though I didn't know anything about it, But YWAM, our Youth of the Mission, was given a place. It used to be, Youth of the Mission used to be evangelism and discipleship, training people to go into missions. But in those refugee camps, there was a new ministry born called Mercy Ministries. And Mercy Ministries were, when we helped the poor and the needy and work in these kind of refugee camps. We had doctors and nurses, and we always did good work. We had a good reputation. And so any job that came up in the refugee camp, the United Nations asked Youth of the Mission, YWAM, if we had anybody who can work there, because they didn't have to pay us. We were volunteers. And so we, that's how I got this job, because they didn't have to pay me anything. And so I was sharing the gospel with these refugees, 100 workers. Every Friday, the United Nations gave me money to pay these workers. So every Friday, when I paid these 100 workers, I would also, either myself or one of these other refugees who had become a Christian, shared the gospel with these workers. And many of them came to know Jesus in the workplace. And also, all the different organizations, the Red Cross and United Nations and the Thai military, if anybody wanted something done in the refugee camp, they had to come to me and ask me and show me what to do. So I became somebody that was known in the refugee camp. And then the next United Nations leader of this other camp wrote a letter saying that anybody who converts one of these Buddhists in the camp to become Christian, not only that person, but the whole organization will have to leave Thailand. And so I got this and I thought, oh, does this mean I can't tell the good news? I can't preach the gospel to these refugees anymore? This is why God sent me here, is to tell these people about Him, not just to do construction work. And so I took this letter from the United Nations to the camp commander, the one who was in charge of the Thai military, because he's over the United Nations. And I said, does this mean I can't tell these people about God anymore? And the camp commander said, Mark, I know you can do whatever you like. So I just ripped that letter up and threw it away. And we continued to disciple these refugees. And I was there for 10 years doing this. The next camp I went to was on the Cambodian border. And we had there in that camp was 300,000 refugees. And so in that camp I became there was that camp that I became the leader of the pharmacy that Youth with a Mission had. So all of a sudden I became a pharmacist. Never studied medicine, never studied anything about pharmacy, but we were given all the jobs. So I learned the medicines that we had and how to give them to the patients. The doctors that we were training the Cambodian people to become medics, so they got educated in the refugee camps how to become medical nurses and doctors, and then I would be there helping train the ones who are giving out the medicine to make sure that they're getting the right medicines. And but what I would do after that, I would go and I would visit the churches, and I was discipling the pastors of 13 different churches in the refugee camp, teaching them how to know God, the whole thing. Remember, make disciples, that is reformation. First, they need to get saved. They need to come to know Jesus. And then reformation is when we teach them God's ways and we help them to get to know God and His plan, His purpose for their lives. And so that's what I did in my spare time. And there was one of the Cambodian generals of the communist army who was in another refugee camp stepped on a landmine and his leg was blown off. So he came to that refugee camp on the border because we had a hospital that made new legs and treated these kind of patients that stepped on landmines, because the communist army had put landmines all along the Cambodian border. So people were stepping on landmines all the time. And still, even to this day, animals and people step on landmines because there's so many of them. That's why nobody can go out of Cambodia and nobody can come into Cambodia. And so this communist general, he came to our camp, and he was the enemy of the free Khmer, the Cambodian people who were not communist. It was the communists who took over the country and who were destroying their country. And so he came into the camp, and he was endangered because of being in this camp. They knew he was a communist general. But we taught these believers to love your enemies like Jesus taught His disciples, and pray for people who have misused you. So the refugees from the church would go to the hospital, and they took care of him. They helped feed him. They gave him a Bible, and they started to teach him God's word. They forgave him. And this communist general could not understand why these Christians were being so nice to him and protecting him and helping him. And then he saw that they were really, they really meant it. They weren't just trying to convert him to religion, but they really loved him and they really took care of him. So he ended up becoming a Christian, this communist leader. And he ended up getting baptized in the Youth of the Mission fish pond. We had a fish pond in the refugee camp where we grew fish, and we taught the Cambodian people how to do agriculture and to grow fish. So in these refugee camps, we were preparing them to eventually go back into Cambodia, and then they have something, an occupation, what they can do, like doctors and nurses and agricultural development. And so this communist leader was baptized, and his life was transformed in the next year as his leg was being healed, and his life was changed completely. So when he was healed and able to walk on his fake leg, it was time for him to go back to the communist camp. But he didn't want to go back because he knew that he doesn't want to go back to fight. And he said to the Cambodian church in the refugee camp that he's not going back to fight anymore, but he's going back to tell his people, thousands of communist people, about Jesus, and that he's not going to fight anymore. And so he went back to the communist camp, and I actually have a photo of him. And this is when he was baptized in the YWAM fish pond. But his life was transformed. But when he went back to his camp, things changed. And it was shortly after that the war ended, and peace came into Cambodia. And the refugees were able to go back to Cambodia. But there's something so powerful about that message, that the gospel, just like with Saul, who was persecuting the Christians, became Paul because he met Jesus and his life was transformed. So this communist leader, his life was changed by the transforming power of the Holy Spirit, and his life was changed forever. And I thank God for that. And I have another photo here that you can see about the construction workers, the 100 construction workers that I had in the bamboo construction office that I had in the refugee camp. I have so many good memories of those refugee camps. But I'll continue some of the stories. With these 13 pastors from the 13 churches in this refugee camp of 300,000, at first they got along really well. But then there was different religions coming into the camp that wanted them to join their religion. And I told these pastors, don't be like the Church of the West, that if you're angry with your brother, that you go and you start another church. Jesus said, if you're angry with your brother, forgive him. And then I taught them what Jesus taught his disciples when they had quarrels and they had differences. He took out a bucket of water and he washed the disciples' feet. And he said to the disciples, I, being your Lord and Savior, I wash your feet. And he asked his disciples that they need to wash one another's feet. And so I told these Cambodian pastors that Jesus said we need to do that. So I got a bucket of water and a cloth, and I washed the feet of these Cambodian pastors, just like Jesus washed his disciples' feet. And then I told them that now you need to wash each other's feet. And so they started to wash each other's feet and forgive each other. And that something broke through them because they came from 3 different political factions. So politically, they did not line up. They didn't believe the same thing. But they, by faith, obeyed what Jesus commanded us to do, to serve one another, to wash one another's feet, to forgive one another, to love one another. New commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you. And by this will all men know that you are my disciples, by your love for one another. And something broke through them at that time. And then it happened again, that they were quarreling. And then I got the bucket out again. Time after time, they learned to serve one another. And that was the beginning of a real powerful unity, because where unity is, God commands his blessing. And I'll speak about that in a later message. And Barnabas was one of the leaders of the camp. And his name was Barnabas. And Barnabas, I have a photo of him too. This is Barnabas. He was one of those Cambodian pastors that went back to Cambodia. And he was a powerful man of God. His name, Barnabas, means son of encouragement, just like the Barnabas in the Bible. And he took on that anointing. So Barnabas, he was used mightily of God in those refugee camps. And he wrote songs. He was a songwriter like David. And he wrote all these beautiful songs with the Cambodian instruments. And he was like a choir director, just like David was. And all these beautiful worship songs were written in the refugee camps that the Cambodians sing all over the world now. Because the Cambodian refugees, many of them, they were, during the first 9 years, they could not go back into Cambodia. So countries like America, they accepted so many refugees. And all through Europe, refugees were accepted. Even here in Finland, Cambodian refugees came here, and I met them here. Some of them I knew. And Australia, New Zealand, refugees went all around the world. And I spoke in the first Cambodian discipleship training school. Not in Cambodia, but it was in Australia. And so these refugees went all over the world, and they went with their Cambodian Bibles, and they brought Jesus with them. And it's so exciting to see how God is using these Cambodians, not only in Cambodia, but all over the world, because they came to know Jesus. They were discipled, and reformed. They met Jesus and came to know him in the refugee camps. But then I got cancer. I'll back up a little bit. I came to Finland in 1985. I met my wife in the refugee camp. She came from Finland and I came from America. And we met in the refugee camp. She was the leader of the library, and I was the leader of the construction. But we were working with Youth of the Mission. Like I said, we had about 100, during those years, we had about over 100 workers working in these refugee camps. And anyway, my love story is that I saw this beautiful Finnish girl. In the 1970s, when I got saved, there was a lot of teaching about and preaching that Jesus is coming back soon. And to me, soon means soon. 2 years, 5 years at the most, and Jesus will be back. So I thought, I'll never get married. So I thought, Jesus called me to these Cambodian refugees. I signed up for 10 years. I thought I would never go back to America. And I thought I'd never get married. And it was quite interesting because we had 90 single women and only 6 single guys, men, working in the refugee camps. And so each one of us men, we had a lot to pick from. But, I was not interested because God gave me a vision to disciple these refugees. And the girls were quite actually complaining to our leadership that why us 6 guys were not interested. They were mostly nurses and doctors and worked in the hospitals. But us guys, most of us were there because we wanted to, we wanted to change the world. We wanted to see every refugee come to know Jesus. We were there to preach the gospel and make disciples. But the women, many of them were there to work in the hospitals. So they were a little bit upset that we were not interested in them. But anyway, long story short, this beautiful Finnish girl came to the refugee camp. I got a picture of her someplace. I'll show it later maybe. She came to the refugee camp and she loved Jesus and she loved the refugees and she loved to pray. She was kind of the one I'd always dreamed about, And so I wanted to ask God, how? What do I do? I have all these strange feelings that I've never felt before. And so I started to pray, and I asked my leader in Thailand to pray for me if it's God's will. And he got back to me right away, and he said, "It's God's will. Go for it." And then I had a spiritual father in New Zealand who I met in the Billy Graham Conference for World Evangelization in Thailand in 1980. He was the principal of the Bible School of New Zealand, and he knew the Bible really well. So I wrote him, and I said, I read in the Bible in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that he who is married seeks to please his wife, but he who is single seeks to please the Lord. And I said, I don't want to please anybody but God. And I met this Finnish girl that she's come to our team. Pray about it because I'm having all these strange feelings. And I don't want to have anything to do with it if it's not from God. And he wrote me back and he said it's from God. And he told me about 1 Corinthians chapter 7, that Paul was speaking to a certain group of people at a certain time. In no way did he ever say, if you get married, somehow you're second class in the kingdom of God. So he said he had been praying for me that God would send me a wife. So I thought, oh, okay, it's his fault. My spiritual father has been praying for me to get a wife. And so anyway, I went off to this island to pray and fast for 3 days. And I said, God, is Hanale, is she a gift from you? And I saw a vision of 2 little lights coming together and became a bright light. And I felt like the Lord spoke deep into my heart that she is going to be your wife. And you two together will become, bring me more glory than when you were single. So I went back from the island that I was praying on, and I didn't know what to say to her because, all of a sudden, she's going to be my wife, but I never talked to her. We washed dishes together a few times, but, I didn't show to any of these women on our team that I was interested at all. But God spoke to her when I was on the island. God spoke to her about Ruth and Boaz, that I would become her husband. And she said, God, how can that be? Because we never spent time together. I don't know this guy. But she prayed and she said, God, if it's from you, I pray that he will ask me to go for a bicycle ride. Because in Thailand, it's hard, the rooms, it's hard to get to know somebody because if there's so many girls, the girls will become jealous if you spend time with one person, So she prayed that God would, that I would ask her to go for a bicycle ride. So I came back to our YWAM Center, Youth and Mission House, and she came to me right away and she said, "What did God speak to you on the island?" And I got really red and embarrassed. And I said, "Oh, just some personal things." I said, "Would you like to go for a bicycle ride?" And she became very embarrassed. All of a sudden, both of us, without ever talking to each other before, we knew that we were going to get married. And so within the next 3 months, we got to know each other a little bit better. And then we came to Finland to get married, and her father and mother were so happy that we were going to get married and that she can go back having a husband, because they were worried about her being single back in that kind of a place. So to make a long story short, we were in love. That's our love story. And we went back to the refugee camps and started to work together in the camps, discipling these refugees. And I'll continue the stories of how God moved in these refugee camps and the testimonies of these refugees in the next session. God bless you. Hello, friends. I want to talk to you about revival. I want you to know that revival is coming to Finland. And actually, it's already started. And that's what I'll be teaching about, is the little signs of revival that I've seen in the north, south, east, and west of Finland as I've been praying for every city and town in Finland and seeing what God is doing. God wants you to know. And this generation is a visual generation. And the young people, they want to see God moving. They don't want to just hear about it, what's happening in Africa or someplace else. They want to actually see it with their own eyes. And TV7 is going to bring this news to you that you can share, and that these young people can start to see that God is moving in a powerful way, even in Finland. And if you would like to support this ministry and get this visual generation, the messages that they can actually see what God is doing, and get them understanding that God is moving right now, not just someplace in the future, then they will get excited and they will want to come and listen and come to know this Jesus that is moving around them. That young people are coming to Christ more than ever before in this nation. And we need to believe that this is the generation that is seeking after God. So they will show you how you can support this ministry of TV7. God bless you.